Back in the CD era, a louder record almost always seemed to sound better than a quieter record because of loudness bias. So there was a lot of demand for loud masters from artists, producers, and labels. And this is usually referred to as the loudness war. So we mastering engineers developed lots of tricks to squeeze another dB or two out of a master. But today, most people listen to music on streaming platforms with loudness normalization, and loud songs will just be lowered in level to the same level as everything else. So many of those old tricks don't make the song sound louder anymore. In some cases, they actually make the song sound worse or quieter after normalization. And since streaming is probably the main target for music releases today, I think it's important to question any old method or strategy that may no longer work as intended. And that's what we're going to look at today. 3 old mastering tricks that were effective during the loudness war, but can actually make your master sound worse on modern streaming services. My name is Thomas, and I have this channel together with Sofia, and here we talk about audio mastering. Let's look at the first trick, hyping the upper mids. This was a super common loudness war kind of trick. When the master sounds nice and is as loud as it can be, but the client still wants it to be a bit louder, it's sometimes possible to just add a dB around 2 to 4 kilohertz and push the whole mix forward. Our ears are especially sensitive around this range, so even a small boost can make a master seem noticeably louder. And this is without putting too much extra strain on the peak limiter. And we can hear how that sounds. I've made an exaggerated example here just to illustrate this. I wouldn't normally use this much boost. This is almost 3 dBs, but it's easier to hear the effect if we exaggerate it. And in a direct comparison like this, without any loudness matching, the hyped version sort of jumps out of the speakers or the headphones. But what happens after loudness normalization? Well, the added energy in the upper mids also make the song measure louder, so it will be turned down more after loudness normalization. And we can see how that looks. This is our own internal tool that I built so that me and Sofia can evaluate masters easier. It shows things like LUFS values, spectral content, and also the spectral difference between the 2 files, in this case the original file and the hyped version. And we can also see things like stereo width and the difference in stereo width, things like that. And everything is loudness normalized in the same way as it would be on most streaming platforms. So it makes it easier to get a feel for how the master will sound in the real world. And we can also see things like momentary and short-term loudness throughout the song, and also how the short-term loudness differs between the 2 files. And this makes it easier to catch if any part of the song has become relatively louder or quieter in the master, for example. So we use it a lot for comparing the master to the original mix, and also for evaluating different master versions in order to find the best approach for any song. So here we can see the difference between the hyped version and the original version without the boost. And we can see that some of the upper mids get louder after loudness normalization, but the rest of the frequencies get quieter. And this is because the hyped version measures louder than the version without the EQ, so it will also be lowered more after loudness normalization. This is the same yin and yang effect that we looked at in a previous video about removing resonances. but here it's the other way around, so to speak. So now we get a sort of loudness disadvantage from adding these upper mids. And after loudness normalization, these two versions will sound about the same loudness to the ears, but most listeners will perceive the hyped version as sounding thinner and harder compared to the non-hyped version. We can hear how that sounds. And as I said, this is an exaggerated example so that we can hear the effect of this quite clearly. And a lot of music from the late 90s and through the 2000s have a bit of a hard edge, because it was very common to push the mids as far as possible without sounding too harsh. And of course, if this is making the mix sound better, then this is something that we definitely can do when mastering. But there are no real advantages in doing it just for the loudness these days. There will always be a sort of optimal point of upper mid energy. And beyond that point, if it gets brighter and harsher than that, then it will go in the other direction and get too bright and too harsh without sounding any louder after loudness normalization. So there's definitely a sweet spot. Okay, so the next trick is thinning out the bass. And this was also a very common trick to do. Because when you had a mix with lots of low end, lots of deep low end, and started pushing that into a peak limiter or into AD clipping, then that could often lead to pumping or distortion. These early peak limiters were not that good at dealing with loud sub-bass, and clipping often sounded better, but at some point it wasn't possible to add more level without audible distortion or pumping or other side effects. So what were the options then? Well, the best solution would of course be to back off on the level a bit, but at the time that wasn't really an option in many cases if you wanted returning clients. So the most common solution would be to simply reduce the amount of low end. Maybe by using a low cut filter or a shelving filter like this, or by compressing the bass, or by using a combination of those things. That could often free up some more room to limit or clip the master some more and get some more absolute loudness. And if there is a strong rumble or something like that in the lowest frequencies that doesn't add anything useful to the sound, then it can definitely be a good idea to reduce that rumble for several reasons. This will often make the limiter work less hard as well. But what happens if you start removing bass that actually sounds nice and is relevant for the music just for the sake of loudness? Well, then the master will sound thinner than it needs to. But if I also add a bit of level, because now I can do that because the final peak limiter isn't working as hard because I have removed the low end. If I do add this level and then do a direct comparison without loudness matching, then it wouldn't necessarily sound thinner. And this is because of loudness bias and the equal loudness curves, or the Fletcher-Munson curves as they are more known as. The added loudness will make the ears fill in the missing bass to some extent. We can hear how this sounds. So cutting the bass to get more loudness could very well sound like an acceptable trade-off in a direct comparison like this without loudness matching. It's almost as if the bass isn't missing at all. But what happens nowadays with loudness normalization? Well, the loudness advantage will be removed and we're left with a thinner sounding song. Simple as that. You can see how that looks. So this is compared to the mix as it is. We can see that the bass has been reduced. There can be a bit of loudness advantage, but it's usually not enough to offset the thinner sound. We can see that over the rest of the frequencies, we get approximately 0.2 dB of gain after loudness normalization, but we lose quite a lot of low end. And this is because the lowest lows doesn't contribute as much to the integrated LUFS measurement. So when we compare now, it will sound pretty much the same, but the thinner version is thinner. And again, if the song needs a bit thinner bass, then this is, of course, the correct move to make. In this case, I don't think it sounds bad in any way with less bass, but it's just something to be aware of. Because when targeting modern streaming platforms, there is usually no advantage in cutting the lows only to get more absolute loudness. That extra loudness will just be turned down after normalization and the song will sound thinner than it did before. So let's look at the last trick, compressing for loudness. And this can be a bit tricky because there are both pros and cons with this one. When going for absolute loudness, compression can be a quite good way to squeeze out an extra dB of level from a mix. If the loudest parts of the song gets a bit quieter, then the overall level can be raised without the loud parts hitting the final limiter too hard. So we can look at an example. Now I have exaggerated this once more, so we can see that during the intro, the compressor isn't working much at all, but during the choruses, it is compressing about 4 dBs. And if these loud parts of a song get a bit quieter, then we can also raise the overall level without the loud parts hitting the final limiter too hard. So now we can raise the average level of the song and it will sound a bit louder in absolute terms. But on streaming platforms, that extra absolute loudness will just get turned down again by the loudness normalization. And what happens to the loud parts then? Well, they end up sounding quieter after loudness normalization than what they would have without the compression. You can see what that looks like. So now the choruses are a bit quieter, half a dB quieter, and the last chorus is almost 1 dB quieter than what it would be without compression. So the last chorus here, for example, if we switch between the compressed version and the non-compressed version, then the last chorus will sound quieter after loudness normalization. But as I said, this is a bit tricky. There are both pros and cons with using compression, because there are two positive things that can happen as well. The first is that the quieter parts can sound louder after loudness normalization. Like here in the verse, the verses are now louder in the compressed version after loudness normalization. And if the choruses were too loud to begin with, then this can be a quite good thing, because now we have put the choruses on the right level, so to speak, and the verses can be a bit louder as a result. And why is this happening? Well, it's because the normalization is based on the integrated LUFS value. And this is more or less the average loudness over the whole song. And this will sit somewhere between the loud parts and the quiet parts of the song. And when we squeeze the loudness difference between the loud parts and the quiet parts, then the quieter parts get closer to the average level, the integrated LUFS value. And we can see that difference here between the uncompressed version and the compressed version, that the quieter parts of this uncompressed version moves up closer to the integrated value, which makes those parts sound louder after normalization. And if the dynamic contrast between the verse and the chorus still sounds nice with compression, then this can be a good thing. The thing that often happens with compression, though, is that the choruses don't really open up or sound as powerful as they could. So that's something to listen for. And if the song starts at full blast, then the initial impression of the song can be more impactful in the version without compression. But in this example, the intro is quite quiet, so then there is a quite drastic difference between the compressed version and the uncompressed version. So that can be a good thing, but this all comes at the expense of the final chorus getting noticeably quieter. So everything is kind of a trade-off, and it's good to be aware of what happens. And I said there were two positive things that can come from compression, and the other good thing that can happen with more compression is that very quiet parts that are just below the gating level of the integrated LUFS measurement can now end up above the gating level and be included in the measurement. Because when measuring the integrated LUFS value, some parts of the song can be excluded from that measurement because they are too quiet. And this is because the LUFS measurement was originally developed for movies and for TV. And then there could be lots of silent or almost silent parts that really shouldn't be contributing to the overall loudness measurement. We just want to measure the sections of the movie or the TV show where there is actual sound. So therefore there is a gate level that decides which part of the song gets excluded from the loudness measurement. So it's not really possible to game the system by adding a minute of silence at the end of the track in order to get the measured loudness down. That silence will just be excluded. But if we want the song to sound as loud as possible after loudness normalization, then we also want to include these quieter parts of the song, because those parts will contribute to making the integrated value lower. And the lower integrated LUFS value means that the song will not be turned down as much after loudness normalization. So we want to include as much as possible of these quiet parts of the song. And in the mix here, we can see that the beginning of the song, the first intro with that synth sound, that is actually below the gating level. So this whole part of the song will not be included in the measurement. And if it had been included, then that would have helped pulling the integrated LUFS value down a bit. So after compression, then we can see that this whole part is actually above the gating level now. So everything is included in the measurement. And this isn't really something that usually matters unless there are longer sections below the gating level. In this case, there might be a slight difference in the measured value, but if it's just a 2-second break in the middle of the song, then that won't make any difference to the measured value. And if there are parts that drop slightly below the gating level, then it can be quite effective to just automate those parts up a bit in level and do that by hand. Then we have more control over how that sounds. But as usual, I think the most important thing is how does things sound. So if the compression is making the sound better, then it should be used, of course. But if it's used only for getting more absolute loudness, then there can be both good things and side effects from doing that. So all three of these tricks each have the potential to both pull the master in the right direction and also in a direction that wasn't intended. And as usual, I have exaggerated the examples in order to make the effects more obvious. In a real-world situation, the effects aren't usually as drastic as this, but mastering is all about optimizing all the details as everything adds up. As a matter of fact, why don't we see what happens if we do all of these things, hype the mids, reduce the lows, and compress the signal? Then we get something that is quite a lot thinner, and it also loses quite a lot of low mids, but we get a bit of upper mids, and we can see that the intro is still loud, the verses get a bit louder, the choruses get a bit quieter, and the final chorus is quite a bit quieter. And it's also quite a bit more hyped and thin. You can hear how it sounds. And of course, this is exaggerated. This is not something that we would do. But just as all these details can add up to a big positive change, they can also add up to a big negative change. And they can also sort of cancel each other out. So we end up with something that sounds different, but not necessarily better. And trying to predict how a master will sound after loudness normalization, it's not always very intuitive. There's a lot of trial and error involved. So since the streaming platforms started to use this loudness normalization by default, then both me and Sofia have been sort of re-evaluating a lot of the methods and tricks that used to work in a certain way back in the CD era, but now the playing field is sort of changed, because anything that we do nowadays that has anything to do with loudness will often be evened out after loudness normalization. And loudness normalization, I think, is a quite big change in how we approach mastering these days. So that's it for this video. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.